New Testament usage of Isaiah chapter 2, Isaiah 25 proves an AD 70 parousia and resurrection. First, Isaiah chapter 2, Isaiah chapter 25 are parallel passages. This is undeniable. Both speak of the Lord's Mount, i.e. Zion, the nation streaming in the day of the Lord. Both speak of the same themes and motifs. So if either passage is quoted or alluded to by a New Testament writer, Isaiah chapter 2 or Isaiah chapter 25, then the other is established as well, since they had the same motifs, the same theme, the same day of the Lord, so on and so forth. And also in Revelation 6, under the sixth seal and the day of the Lord, both Isaiah chapter 2 and Isaiah chapter 24 are alluded to. So for John, both are one and the same. And we must remember Isaiah chapter 24 through 27 is the apocalypse of Isaiah. Isaiah chapter 13 through 23 is the judgment of the nations. That's one section, but within that section there's another section, Isaiah 24 through 27, the apocalypse of Isaiah. Now, establishing the resurrection, Paul in 1 Corinthians chapter 15 quotes from Isaiah chapter 25 and verse 8. And Isaiah chapter 25 verse 8 reads, "He will swallow up death for all time, and the Lord will wipe away tears from all faces, and he will remove the reproach of his people from the earth, for the Lord has spoken." And that's used by Paul in 1 Corinthians chapter 15 in establishing his understanding of the resurrection. But again, Isaiah chapter 25 is the same as Isaiah chapter 2, because you have, as I said, the nations streaming into Zion and God ruling over the nation, Zion, the Lord's Mount, being established, the kingdom, the day of the Lord. Isaiah 2 and 25, they're the same, just like Isaiah 52 would be the same. Isaiah 43, 49, it's all speaking of the same time period, the restoration of Israel and the Gentiles, the nations, streaming in. And so this is established. Isaiah 25, Isaiah chapter 2 are one and the same. And you're going to say, well, what's the point, Joel? Paul quotes from Isaiah 25, 8 in 1 Corinthians 15 for his resurrection idea, his understanding, his doctrine of the resurrection. Well, the New Testament usage of Isaiah chapter 2, and I'll read a little bit of Isaiah chapter 2, and then we're going to go to the words of Christ, and we're going to go to John in Revelation chapter 6. Isaiah 2 verse 2 through 4, and then we'll read a couple other texts. "Now it will come about in the last days, the mountain of the house of the Lord will be established as the chief of the mountains, and will be raised above the hills, and all the nations will stream to it. And so many peoples will come and say, 'Come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of God, the God of Jacob, that he may teach us concerning his ways, that we may walk in his paths. For the law will go forth from Zion, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. He will judge between the nations, and he will render decisions for many peoples. And they will hammer their swords into plowshares, and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation will not rise up sword against nation, and will never learn again war." And so the tabernacle would be established on top, the Messianic tabernacle, the Davidic tabernacle would be established on top of the mountains, and the nations would stream in with the remnant of Israel. Now we read on, this same day of the Lord, there's judgment. Verse 10, "Enter the rock and hide in the dust for the terror of the Lord, and from the splendor of his majesty. The proud look of man will be abased, and the loftiness of man will be humbled, and the Lord alone will be exalted in that day." And if we read on, verse 19, "Men will go into the caves and into the rocks and into the holes of the ground before the terror of the Lord and the splendor of his majesty, when he rises and makes the earth tremble." Verse 21, "In order to go into the caverns of the rocks and the clefts of the cliffs, before the terror of the Lord and the splendor of his majesty, when he arises to make the earth tremble." Jesus in Luke chapter 23 quotes from Isaiah chapter 2, what we just read, them hiding in the rocks, the splendor of the Lord, so on and so forth. Paul quotes it in 2 Thessalonians chapter 1, and it's in John chapter 6. We're just going to concentrate on Luke chapter 23 and John chapter 6, the sixth seal. Now let's look how Christ uses this. In 2 Thessalonians 1, I believe is 80-70 as well, as he's drawn heavily from Isaiah, and Isaiah chapter 29 through 37. Paul's heavily drawn from there in Thessalonians, I believe, as well. Speaking of the vindication of the saints, the same as 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, 14 through 16. Now, so 1 Corinthians chapter 15, we have Isaiah chapter 25. But Isaiah chapter 25 is the same day of the Lord, the same, the Lord's mountain being established, the nation streaming in of Isaiah chapter 2. Okay, let's go to Luke chapter 23, the words of Christ. The words of Jesus. Luke 23, this is an amazing passage, people. Look at Luke chapter 23, verse 28 through 31. But Jesus turning to them, he's being led up to be crucified. Daughters of Jerusalem, stop weeping for me, but weep for yourselves and for your children, for behold, the days are coming, when they will say, blessed are the barren, and the wombs that never bore, and the breasts that never nursed. Then they will say to the mountains, fall on us, and the hills cover us. For if they do these when the tree is in green, what will happen when it is dry? And so he's alluding from Hosea 10 in Isaiah chapter 2 there, and he applies it to AD 70. He's telling them the time is coming. Do not weep for me, but weep for your children, for this is going to happen. Isaiah 2. He applies it to AD 70, the day of the Lord of Isaiah chapter 2. Going to Revelation chapter 6. Revelation chapter 6, which is probably one of my favorite passages in Revelation. Revelation 6, Revelation 14. Revelation 6 under the sixth seal. What do we have? We have Isaiah chapter 24, which is the same as 25. 24 through 27 is one section. And we have Isaiah chapter 6. So for John, Isaiah 24 through 27 is the same as Isaiah chapter 6. At verse 12 of Revelation 6, and I looked, and he broke the sixth seal, and there was a great earthquake, and the sun became black, and the sackcloth made of hair, and the whole moon became like blood. Well, that's the Oriental apocalyptic language that we see in Isaiah, in Jeremiah, over and over again. And the stars of the sky fell on the earth, as a fig tree casts in the unripe figs, when shaken by the great wind. Verse 15, then the kings of the earth and the great men of the commanders and the rich and the strong and every slave and free man hid themselves on the caves and in the rocks of the mountains. That's Isaiah chapter 2, verse 9, 10, and 21. And they said to the mountains and the rocks, fall on us and hide us from the presence of him who sits on the throne, from the wrath of the Lamb. For the great day of the wrath has come. Who is able to stand? If we look in Revelation chapter 6, the first seals, R.C. Charles was the first commentator that made the point that this is taken from Matthew chapter 24. You have the famines, a pestilence, war, so on and so forth. This is Matthew 24, the Olivet Discourse. Revelation chapter 6, 1 through 8. Very, very clearly taken from the Olivet Discourse, as is the whole book of Revelation. Is Matthew chapter 24 and 25. It's John's Olivet Discourse. Verse 9, when the Lamb broke the fifth seal, I saw underneath the altar the souls of those who had been slain because of the word of God and because of the testimony which they maintained. And they cried, how long, O Lord, holy and true, will you refrain from judging and avenging our blood? And he said, gave them white robes and said, rest a little while. That's Luke chapter 18, verse 8, where Jesus says he will avenge them speedily. Speaking of the judgment upon Jerusalem. So in this day of the Lord here, which is the day of the Lord against Jerusalem in AD 70, the second coming, the Parousia, there's no doubt about that. I can establish that if I had more time. He quotes from Isaiah chapter 2, and as well verse 12 and 13. He's quoting from Isaiah chapter 24. I'm looking here. In verse 18 and 23 he's alluding from. So in 12 and 13 you have Isaiah chapter 24, and then in verse 15 and 16 you have Isaiah chapter 2. They're one and the same. They're one and the same. So Jesus uses Isaiah chapter 2, and speaking of AD 70, John here, which is taken from Matthew chapter 4 and the vindication of the martyrs, which the vindication of the martyrs rest a little while, or he will avenge them speedily, Luke 18, that would happen upon that generation. Luke 11 verse 41 through 50, 49 through 51, and Matthew chapter 23, 29 and following. All the blood shed upon the earth, from Abel to righteous Zechariah, will be required of this generation, and that's Revelation 18, of course. All the blood shed upon the earth will be required of Babylon. But if we look to, when it comes to Isaiah 25, verse 8, we see it again in Revelation chapter 7, 17, speaking of the 144,000 coming out of the Great Tribulation. For the Lamb in the center of the throne will be their shepherd, and will guide them to the springs of water of life, and God will wipe away every tear from their eyes. This is the 144,000, the faithful remnant of Israel, prophesied in the prophets, and they're coming out of the Great Tribulation. These 144,000 first fruit Christians, they are the first fruit of the harvest. And yet we know when the Great Tribulation was to take place, according to Matthew 24, 21, it would happen. All of these things will take place in this generation, Jesus said. He didn't say most or some, he said all. If you want to put Matthew 24 in the future, all these things are in this generation. If that generation is future, all of Matthew 24 is future. You can't take some of it, put it back in AD 70, and put some of it in the future. Jesus said all within this generation. Verse 34. And Revelation 18:22, Isaiah 24 verse 8 is used again in the judgment of Jerusalem, Babylon. Revelation 18 verse 22. And the sound of the harpists and musicians and flute players and trumpeters will not be heard in you any longer. That's Babylon. And no craftsman of any craft will be found in you any longer. And sound of mill will not be heard in you any longer. Matthew 24 verse 8. So we have Matthew chapter 25 in 1 Corinthians 15, but we also have Matthew chapter 24 in Revelation 6, which is AD 70, Matthew 25 in Revelation 7, which is AD 70, Revelation chapter 18, verse 22, the judgment of Babylon, the great city where our Lord was slain. We have Matthew chapter 24, and again in Revelation 21 in the New Jerusalem. Also, another point, Isaiah chapter 25 verse 6 speaks of this banquet that would take place upon the mountain. This banquet obviously is the wedding banquet, the messianic banquet that the Jews were waiting for, and there's no doubt when that banquet would happen. Staying in Revelation chapter 19, let me see here. Let us rejoice and be glad and give glory to him, for the marriage of the Lamb has come, and his bride has made herself ready. So on and so forth. So this is the coming of the kingdom, Revelation chapter 19. It has Jesus coming, flame of eyes of fire, so on and so forth. He would tread the wine press. That's the harvest of wrath of Revelation chapter 14. And King of Kings and Lord of Lords he's coming as. This is Jesus in Revelation 19 coming at his coming. This is his parousia, his coming kingdom marriage. We go to Matthew chapter 22. Matthew chapter 22. And it's identical. Jesus and John are on the same page. Coming kingdom, marriage. But Matthew 22 is even more explicit. Jesus spoke to them again in parables, saying, the kingdom of heaven. So this is the kingdom. The kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who had a wedding feast for his son. So we have the kingdom, the wedding. That's Revelation chapter 19. The kingdom and the wedding. He made a feast for his son. That's Yahweh. Made a feast for his son. That's Jesus. And he sent out his slaves to call those who had been invited to the wedding feast. And they were unwilling to come. National Israel. Again he sent to them slaves, saying, tell those who have been invited, behold, I prepared my dinner, my oxen, my fatted calf, fatted livestock, and are butchered, and everything is ready. Come to the wedding feast. But they paid no attention, and went their own way, one to his farm, another to his business. And the rest seized his slaves and mistreated them and killed them. That's the prophets. But the king was enraged, and he sent his armies and destroyed those murderers and set their city on fire. Well, what's that? That's AD 70. Everyone agrees Matthew 22:7 is AD 70, but this is the time of the marriage, the time of the kingdom. This is the same as Matthew chapter 8, verse 11. Some would be sitting in the kingdom with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but the sons of the kingdom would be cast out. You see? And we read on, then he said to his slaves, the wedding is ready. See, a lot of people, and I've noticed, they try to slip a gap in here, 2,000-year gap. Yes, verse 7, speaking of AD 70, but there's a 2,000-year gap between 7 and 8. No, there's not. The wedding still goes on. Despite their rejection, just like Luke chapter 19, Matthew chapter 21, and here in Matthew 22, despite the Jewish rejection and unbelief of the kingdom offer, the kingdom still went on. It was not postponed. Luke 19 needs to be taken a look at as well concerning that. So yeah, just to refresh very briefly, Matthew chapter, or 1 Corinthians chapter 15 quotes from Isaiah 25 verse 8. Isaiah chapter 24 through 27 is the same as Isaiah chapter 2, but Isaiah chapter 2, according to Jesus, and Luke chapter 23, is AD 70, and according to John in Revelation chapter 6, is AD 70. And so that would establish the timing of, and of course we have the idea of first fruits, 1 Corinthians 15:20. This would establish the resurrection, in my opinion, in AD 70, the resurrection of 1 Corinthians 15. And of course the day of the Lord when it comes to Isaiah chapter 2, Jesus' usage of it and John's usage of it. And we see the usage of Matthew chapter 24 in Revelation 7, in Revelation 18, which are contexts of the tribulation and judgment of Jerusalem. So it all ties together, in my opinion, very, very nicely. Matthew 24 and through 27 and Isaiah chapter 2 ties together perfectly, like hand in glove. And when we let the New Testament writers interpret the Old Testament promises, we have no choice but to see fulfillment in AD 70. No choice whatsoever, in my opinion. But that's probably about it, guys. Kind of going off the cuff, but I wrote a couple texts down that I could touch on. Thanks for watching.